Imagine whispered truths colliding with ominous silence. They try to bury it. They try to erase every trace. But no matter how deep they dug the graves, no matter how many documents they burned, one truth remains. The Wentworth name carries a curse, one that has haunted America's shadows for centuries. Before we go further, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and share it now. Because what you are about to hear, what you are about to uncover, was never meant for your ears. And tell me right now in the comments, where are you watching this from? I want to know exactly where you sit as these forbidden words seep into your mind. The Wentworths were not just another wealthy colonial family. They were power brokers, manipulators, men and women who pulled strings from behind velvet curtains while the common man thought freedom was being born. But freedom was an illusion, and the Wentworths thrived in that illusion. Imagine a dynasty whose influence was so deeply woven into the foundation of America that removing them would have collapsed the entire structure. A family who appeared noble, yet whose very name became synonymous with whispers of blood rituals, secret alliances, and a shadow network that extended far beyond the colonies. Why then? Have you never heard their name in your school books? Why do historians glance over them, as though their entire existence is a stain too dangerous to acknowledge? It is not an accident. It is not neglect. It is deliberate erasure. Every great nation has its hidden architects, and the Wentworths, unlike the Rockefellers or the Morgans who flaunted their wealth, chose a different path: secrecy. They carved their empire in silence, trading not in gold, but in influence, fear, and manipulation. Their power was invisible, yet undeniable. Their curse, inescapable. And here's the truth that chills me even as I speak it. Every time a Wentworth reached too far into the forbidden, destruction followed. Towns burned. Families vanished. Leaders collapsed. Wars shifted. And yet the Wentworths endured, never in daylight, always in shadow. But shadows cannot remain unbroken forever. The curse they carried was not merely upon them, but upon all who dared to follow in their path. That curse still lingers in the soil of America today. The question is, what was it? What did the Wentworths touch that condemned them, and all who knew them, to silence, secrecy, and ruin? Their first betrayal began long before America was even born. The year was 1631. The ship Lion carried among its passengers a man whose name would one day become taboo: William Wentworth. On the surface, he appeared no different from the other settlers, another weary traveler seeking fortune in the New World. But beneath his calm face, beneath his carefully measured words, he carried something far heavier: a lineage cursed in England, and an oath sworn to forces that demanded blood for loyalty. In England, whispers already followed the Wentworths. They were accused of betraying crown and church alike, playing both sides in wars that tore the nation apart. Landowners cursed their name. Priests condemned their silence, during which trials where others were burned alive. And yet, somehow, they always escaped fire and rope. It was said that William's great-uncle, Thomas Wentworth, bargained his loyalty not with kings, but with the unseen powers that kings themselves feared. When William's feet touched American soil, he was not beginning a new life. He was continuing an ancient contract. The New World was not freedom for him. It was opportunity. A land still drenched in the blood of native peoples, where spirits and curses lingered in forests and rivers, waiting for men bold or foolish enough to disturb them. The Wentworths built quickly. They acquired land, not through honest toil, but through deals that left others ruined. They whispered into the ears of Puritan leaders, shaping laws that favored their estates. They held church pews in front rows while their enemies were quietly crushed in debt, scandal, or mysterious misfortune. And still, people noticed something unnatural. Crops withered near their homesteads. Children fell ill in towns they passed through. Workers swore they saw strange lights in Wentworth fields at night, lights that moved like silent torches with no carriers. Some said the family had brought England's demons with them, planting them into America's soil like seeds. Others said they had found something older here, something native and furious, and had bound it to their name in exchange for power. Yet, history does not write of their curse. It only writes of their success. William Wentworth became a founder of New Hampshire's ruling class. His children intermarried with the most powerful bloodlines of the colonies. The Wentworths' influence stretched like invisible fingers into politics, trade, and even the very courts of justice. But power always leaves a mark, and the Wentworth mark was darker than ink. It was blood. It was silence. It was the kind of influence that could not be traced on paper, but could be felt in the cold unease of every man who dared oppose them. And one man did oppose them. He vanished without a trace. His name has been nearly erased, as though someone took a knife to the records themselves. A merchant, a man of principle, who dared to speak openly against the Wentworth family in Portsmouth. His words were simple, yet lethal to those who thrived on shadows. He accused the Wentworths of holding power they could not explain. He warned that their fortune was not earned, but conjured, that it came at the expense of neighbors who suddenly, inexplicably, lost everything. Days later, his house was found abandoned. His wife wept in the street, insisting he had gone to meet William Wentworth himself to resolve their dispute. But he never returned. Witnesses claimed they saw him enter the Wentworth estate on a moonless night, but none saw him leave. And then came the silence. His name disappeared from public records. The debts he claimed against the Wentworths were erased. Even the church spoke nothing of him, as though he had never existed. His wife, soon after, was taken in by the church for madness. His children were adopted by other families. The entire bloodline was absorbed into history's void. What happened that night? In whispers passed down through generations, the story remains. The Wentworth estate was not silent after he arrived. Neighbors claimed they heard chanting, low, steady, rhythmic, rising with a power that made dogs howl and infants scream in their cribs. Some swore they saw shadows moving along the walls of the mansion's upper rooms, shadows shaped like no man. And when the chanting ended, the night was split by a scream so piercing it carried across the harbor waters. After that night, the Wentworths rose higher. Their land doubled. Their influence expanded into the colonial courts. Governors and ministers leaned on their counsel. And those who remembered the merchant's warning began to wonder, had the family made another bargain? Or was this simply the curse feeding, claiming another soul as payment for their ascent? It was then that the first phrase began to circulate among townspeople, whispered in fear. To cross a Wentworth is to be erased. It became more than rumor. It became survival. Neighbors kept their distance. Workers accepted unfair wages. Ministers turned their heads. Because the truth was clear, the Wentworths were untouchable, not by God, not by law, not by man. But curses do not respect boundaries. And soon, what began within their household began to seep outward, infecting not just enemies, but allies, children, and even blood itself. And the first to bear its weight was their own heir. The heir was John Wentworth, William's proud descendant, a man born into privilege, yet haunted from the moment he drew breath. Neighbors whispered that the child's birth was accompanied by unnatural storms, winds tearing shingles from rooftops, lightning splitting a tree beside the church, thunder that shook the earth though no rain ever fell. Midwives said his eyes opened too soon, staring not at his mother, but at the ceiling as though something unseen hovered above him. John grew into a man of ambition. He was intelligent, persuasive, gifted with the kind of charm that makes leaders follow without question. And yet, wherever he went, calamity followed. When he took a position in colonial government, his rivals suffered sudden illnesses. When he invested in ships, storms wrecked competitors while his vessels returned untouched. When he courted allies, their enemies were disgraced overnight. People began to fear his success, not because of his skill, but because of the pattern. Fortune never favored him without someone else's ruin. It was as though the curse demanded balance. Every rise required another's destruction. And then there was the matter of his dreams. Journals belonging to his household servants, unearthed centuries later, speak of John waking in the dead of night, screaming names of people who would later vanish from Portsmouth without explanation. Servants claimed he spoke in tongues as though another voice borrowed his throat. One entry describes finding him in the cellar at dawn, hands raw from clawing at the stone floor, insisting he was digging out the old ones beneath. Yet John's public face told another story. He rose to the rank of lieutenant governor, a polished leader who smiled for portraits and toasted victories with colonial elites. His home became a gathering place for ministers, traders, and officials. But beneath the laughter and music, there was something darker in the air. Guests left with strange illnesses. Business deals forged at his table dissolved into ruin for one side and prosperity for the other. And those who dared to question his uncanny luck often disappeared within weeks. It was John who cemented the Wentworth family into America's ruling class, entangling them with the very roots of colonial power. But even he could not outrun what stalked his bloodline. His reign ended not with triumph, but with whispers of betrayal, madness, and death, rumors too dangerous for official history to record. And what consumed him did not vanish with his body. It passed on. It always passed on, because a curse this old does not end with a man. It waits for the next. When John Wentworth was lowered into the earth, the town did not mourn. The funeral was large, but the faces in the crowd were tight, unreadable, as though they feared to show too much grief or too much relief. The soil swallowed his coffin, yet what had lived inside him did not rest. It moved outward, like smoke escaping a sealed chamber. And soon, the Wentworth curse was no longer confined to the family bloodline. It began with those closest to him. His most loyal servant, a man who had lived under his roof for 20 years, was found wandering the docks days after the burial, eyes vacant, whispering the same phrase over and over. The debt is not paid. The debt is not paid. No one ever saw him again after that night. Then came the ministers. 3 of them, all of whom had dined at John's table during his final weeks, died within months, each one from strange, violent fevers. Their sermons were left unfinished, their churches unsettled, their congregations restless. And though their deaths were explained as plague or God's will, the people knew better. They had seen the way these men had looked at John's coffin, pale with dread, whispering prayers under their breath that no one could quite hear. Merchants, too, began to fall. Those who had partnered with the Wentworth estate found themselves ruined by unseen forces. Ships wrecked on clear seas, warehouses catching fire without flame, debts called in by men they had never borrowed from. It was as though aligning with the Wentworths meant inheriting not only their wealth, but their curse. Whispers spread through Portsmouth. The Wentworths do not bury their dead. They plant them. And if that was true, then the ground itself was poisoned, an unholy seed growing in the soil of America. The strangest part? The family's power only grew. Every death, every ruin, every disappearance seemed to expand their influence. As though the curse fed on destruction, and with every life it claimed, the Wentworth shadow spread further across the colonies. But curses are never content with servants, ministers, or merchants. They hunger for blood. And soon, the curse turned inward again, reaching for the youngest heirs, the children who bore the name. And one child in particular would become the living proof that the Wentworths had unleashed something that could never be contained. The child's name was Samuel Wentworth, and from the moment of his birth, it was clear that he was not like other children. His mother insisted that the midwives keep the shutters closed during labor, for when Samuel entered the world, an unnatural chill filled the room. Candles flickered though no wind stirred, and one by one the flames extinguished themselves. The women present swore they heard whispers in the dark corners of the chamber, voices speaking in a language none could understand. As Samuel grew, his strangeness became undeniable. By the age of 5, he spoke of things no child should know, describing family secrets with uncanny detail, recounting events from generations past that only William Wentworth himself could have witnessed. At night, he walked the halls of the estate in silence, his eyes wide open, muttering phrases about debts, contracts, and names long buried. His parents tried to silence him, but their whispers of fear traveled farther than they realized. Soon, neighbors began to avoid the family altogether. Animals refused to go near Samuel. Horses reared when he approached. Dogs whimpered and scratched at doors to escape him. And cats, it was said, simply vanished whenever he came near. Even the forests around the Wentworth estate grew unnaturally still when Samuel wandered into them, as if the very land recoiled from his presence. Yet the family, bound by ambition, did not reject him. They flaunted him as an heir touched by destiny, calling him the child of promise. Ministers, invited to bless him, found themselves shaken to the core. One recorded in his diary that Samuel's eyes seemed to look not at me, but through me, as if another presence stood behind my flesh. Another wrote simply, "This boy is marked. I dare not return." But the curse was not patient. At just 9 years old, Samuel's presence became deadly. Playmates who spent time with him fell mysteriously ill, wasting away within days. One child drowned in shallow water, though he had been seen playing at the edge with Samuel moments before. Parents began to whisper that Samuel was not a boy at all, but a vessel, a container for something the Wentworths had unleashed centuries before. And when tragedy finally struck within the family itself, when a cousin his age was found lifeless in bed with no wound, no illness, only a look of pure terror frozen on his face, the whispers turned into certainty. The curse had chosen its new host. By the time Samuel reached adolescence, the Wentworth estate had become a place people dared not enter after sunset. What had once been a proud manor, built to showcase wealth and dominance, now stood like a fortress of unease. Farmers who worked its land complained of tools breaking in their hands, of sudden nosebleeds beneath the summer sun, of hearing footsteps behind them when no one was there. Travelers who passed too close swore they saw figures in the windows, tall, still silhouettes that vanished when torches drew near. And at the center of it all was Samuel. His parents, desperate to control him, sent tutors and ministers to mold him into a proper heir. None stayed longer than a month. Some fled in the night without explanation, leaving their belongings behind. One was found dead in the woods, his body twisted in unnatural angles, his face frozen in a mask of terror. His last journal entry contained only 3 words, "The boy knows." Neighbors whispered that Samuel spoke with voices not his own. Servants claimed he could predict deaths before they happened, reciting names days before the afflicted would fall ill or vanish. Others said he wandered the fields at night, barefoot, speaking softly into the darkness as though carrying on a conversation with the unseen. When questioned, he gave only cryptic replies, "They answer me." The estate itself seemed to warp around him. Crops planted near the house failed. Milk curdled overnight. Wells filled with insects, forcing families to drink from distant streams. Even the livestock grew thin and restless, many found dead with no sign of struggle, as though life itself had simply abandoned them. And yet, despite the horror, the Wentworth name only grew in strength. Land acquisitions expanded. Colonial leaders sought their counsel. Samuel himself, though feared, was treated as a prodigy, his strange visions used to guide trade, predict storms, and outmaneuver rivals. To many, it seemed as though the family had finally embraced the curse, bending it into a weapon rather than fleeing from it. But power always demands payment. Samuel's own siblings began to suffer. Illnesses, accidents, madness. One sister leapt from the upper floor of the estate, claiming the watchers would not leave her alone. Another was said to have wasted away, whispering Samuel's name until her final breath. The curse was no longer silent. It was feeding. It was spreading. And those who dared whisper the truth feared only one question. If Samuel was the vessel, what exactly was he carrying? By Samuel's 17th year, the shadow around him had grown too vast to be ignored. What once seemed like whispers and coincidences now began to fracture the colony itself. Families who had long allied with the Wentworths found themselves unraveling. Wealthy merchants lost entire fleets to sudden storms, while Wentworth ships sailed safely through the same waters. Prominent ministers, once bold in condemning sin, fell silent, their sermons stripped of fire, their eyes heavy with fear. It was as if Samuel's presence had reached beyond his household, twisting the destiny of Portsmouth and pulling it into a web no one could escape. The boy became a man, but the man was more terrifying than the child. Witnesses claimed his voice sometimes split, two tones speaking at once, one commanding, the other echoing like a whisper from deep within a cavern. When he sat in council beside his elders, rivals crumbled before him, their arguments dissolving into stammered excuses, their willpower broken by a gaze that seemed to strip them bare. A colonial officer once remarked that standing before Samuel felt like kneeling before a judge who was not of this world. But the most chilling stories did not come from governors or merchants. They came from the common folk. Fishermen claimed to see Samuel walking the harbor at night, his reflection not matching his movements in the water. Farmers awoke to find symbols burned into their fields, spirals and circles that no plow could have carved, their animals dead in precise, unnatural patterns. Children spoke of a man with Samuel's face who visited them in dreams, whispering secrets about their families that no one else could possibly know. Still, the Wentworth fortune grew. Every crop failure, every ruined merchant, every silenced minister somehow cleared the path for their dominance. It was as though the curse was not a weight at all, but a crown, lifting the family higher every time it destroyed someone else. And Samuel wore that crown without fear, as if he understood the bargain better than anyone before him. But bargains always turn. By feeding the curse so openly, by embracing it as his birthright, Samuel had awakened something darker than whispers, something that could not be controlled. The land itself began to shift. Storms came without warning, disease spread in waves, and even the most loyal allies began to question whether standing with the Wentworths meant survival or damnation. And then, on one night, recorded in hushed journals and terrified letters, Samuel revealed just how deep his bond with the unseen truly went. The night was marked in every diary that survived it. October 12, 1692. A moonless sky, heavy with clouds, pressed down upon Portsmouth. The air was suffocating, still, as if the town itself was holding its breath. That evening, Samuel Wentworth summoned a gathering at the estate. The reason, he claimed, was to celebrate a new land acquisition. But those who attended would later say it was not a celebration at all. It was a revelation. Dozens arrived, merchants, ministers, officers, their wives. They filled the great hall, uneasy beneath the towering portraits of Wentworth ancestors staring down with cold, painted eyes. At the center stood Samuel, now a man in full command of his presence. He raised a glass, but instead of offering words of prosperity, he whispered a phrase in a tongue no one recognized. The firelight dimmed. The glass shattered in his hand, yet no blood spilled. What followed was chaos. The doors slammed shut of their own accord. Guests cried out as the air grew colder, the walls seeming to tremble as if something pressed against them from outside. Several witnesses claimed that shadows detached themselves from the corners, moving freely across the room, circling the guests like predators. One minister collapsed, muttering prayers that dissolved into screams. And then came the voice, not Samuel's, but something speaking through him. Deeper, older, vibrating in the marrow of every man and woman present. The words were indistinguishable, yet their meaning was felt: submission. A demand for silence, loyalty, fear. Some fell to their knees, others clawed at the locked doors. A merchant's wife fainted, her body convulsing on the floor until her eyes rolled white. When at last the terror subsided, the torches roared back to life. The doors swung open. Samuel stood in the center, calm, smiling faintly as though nothing had happened. But the guests fled in silence, none daring to speak of what they had seen. To admit it was to invite it back. To deny it was to pretend survival was still possible. Yet word spread, carried in trembling whispers. Samuel Wentworth had shown his true inheritance. He was no longer simply cursed. He was chosen, a vessel that commanded not just fear, but allegiance born of terror. But the question burned hotter than ever in the minds of those who escaped that hall. What power had the Wentworths bound themselves to? And how long could such a power remain hidden in the dark before consuming everything in its path? After that night, in 1692, Portsmouth was never the same. The event at the Wentworth estate was spoken of only in whispers, yet its impact seeped into every corner of the colony like ink bleeding into paper. Men who had once opposed the Wentworths fell silent. Their businesses were sold, their voices vanished from town meetings, their families moved away without explanation. Ministers who had thundered against corruption now spoke in vague parables, never daring to mention sin by name. And those who had been in Samuel's presence, those who had heard that impossible voice speak through him, walked with a kind of hollow obedience, as though part of them had been taken and would never return. But silence could not contain the unease. Common folk began to sense it too. Mothers kept their children indoors, terrified of the dream man, with Samuel's face who came to them at night. Fishermen refused to sail on certain days, claiming they saw omens in the tide, dark shapes moving beneath the waves, waiting. Farmers spoke of fields that rotted overnight, only to find strange symbols burned into the soil, the same spirals and circles that had been whispered about years earlier. What unsettled people most was the obedience of the elite. Governors, judges, and merchants, men who once strutted through Portsmouth with pride, now deferred to the Wentworths without question. A single look from Samuel silenced debate. A mere suggestion became law. The colony's future was no longer decided by assemblies or councils. It was decided in the halls of the Wentworth estate, where unseen voices guided unseen hands. And yet, with this power came cracks too deep to ignore. Strange illnesses swept through the town. Entire households reported waking to the same nightmare on the same night. Visions of a great black figure standing in the harbor, its arms stretching out over the settlement like wings. Ships began to disappear at sea, their crews never found, their cargoes swallowed without trace. Every disaster, every loss, every disappearance seemed to grow in proportion to the Wentworths' wealth and Samuel's influence. The colony had entered a pact it never signed, and the question was no longer whether the Wentworths were cursed. It was whether all of Portsmouth had now fallen under the same shadow. And then, one winter evening, a child's voice broke the silence. A voice not of fear, but of defiance. And for the first time, the curse met resistance. The child's name is lost to history, deliberately erased, perhaps, as though even memory itself feared to keep it alive. What is known comes only from scraps of letters, half-burned journals, and the trembling testimonies of those who lived long enough to whisper the tale. One bitter winter night, while the Wentworth estate hosted another of its infamous gatherings, a child no older than 12 wandered the frozen streets of Portsmouth. He was the son of a fisherman, poor, nameless among the colonial gentry. But his voice carried further than any sermon, because it spoke the one thing no one else dared, the truth. In the town square, beneath a sky of brittle stars, he shouted of what everyone had seen but none admitted. He cried that Samuel Wentworth was not a man, but a vessel, that the land itself had grown sick because of him, and that those who bowed to the Wentworths were already damned. His voice cracked, but it cut through the stillness like a blade. People gathered, trembling, unable to look away. Witnesses say his eyes glowed in the torchlight with a conviction that no child should possess. He warned that the curse demanded more than obedience. It demanded sacrifice. That every storm, every plague, every missing soul was not chance but payment. And that soon, the debt would be demanded from every family in Portsmouth, not just those who opposed the Wentworths. The crowd listened, caught between terror and awe. For the first time, someone had spoken aloud what they had buried deep within themselves. Mothers clutched their children closer. Fathers shifted uneasily, afraid the boy's words might invite wrath upon them all. And then it happened. The boy's voice cut off mid-sentence. His eyes widened, and he clutched his throat as though an invisible hand gripped it. The crowd gasped. Some swore they saw Samuel standing at the far edge of the square, watching silently, though no footsteps had announced his arrival. Others claimed only shadows stretched there, coiling like smoke. The boy fell to his knees, choking. The crowd surged forward, but before anyone could reach him, he collapsed into the snow, lifeless. No wound, no struggle, only silence. His body lay still, but his words remained burning in the minds of all who had heard him. For the first time, Portsmouth realized the curse did not just erase opponents quietly. It could strike openly in full view of all. And if even a child's voice could summon its fury, then nowhere, no one, was safe. And in that silence, the town itself began to fracture. The boy's death was the breaking point. Portsmouth split like a ship's hull in a storm. For years, the people had lived under a silent pact. Fear the Wentworths, obey their influence, and perhaps survive untouched. But after the child collapsed in the snow, that illusion shattered. The curse was no longer hidden in whispers and locked rooms. It had shown itself in the open, in the heart of the town, before the eyes of common men and women. Some bent further into obedience. Merchants swore deeper loyalty to the Wentworth estate, terrified that their families would be next. Ministers revised their sermons into hollow praises of chosen vessels and God's mysterious judgment, twisting Scripture into a justification for silence. These were the ones who bowed willingly, who chose survival over defiance, even as their own congregations muttered in unease. But others, farmers, sailors, laborers, began to resist. Quietly at first, in back rooms and barns lit by candlelight, they spoke of rebellion, not against the king, not against the colony's governors, but against the Wentworths themselves. They whispered of the boy's warning, that the curse demanded sacrifice, and that it would never stop unless the family's bloodline was broken. These men and women were unarmed, untrained, but driven by desperation. They began to mark their doors with symbols of protection. Crude carvings of circles crossed through with X's, hoping to keep Samuel's gaze from finding them. The town became a place of tension, thick with paranoia. Neighbors accused neighbors of spying for the Wentworths. Families fled in the night, abandoning homes and crops, vanishing into the wilderness. And yet, no matter how far they ran, stories followed. Strange illnesses, broken fortunes, and shadows that seemed to travel with them. The curse, it seemed, was not bound to Portsmouth alone. The most chilling accounts came from those who chose to resist openly. One sailor, known for speaking against Samuel in the tavern, was found adrift in the harbor. His body lashed upright to the mast of his own ship, eyes burned black as if seared by fire from within. Another man, a minister who dared to condemn the Wentworth from the pulpit, was found at the altar one morning, his mouth sewn shut with twine, no sign of forced entry into the church. Resistance carried a cost, and the Wentworths paid nothing for it. The debt always fell upon the people. Still, resistance did not die. If anything, the horrors only sharpened their resolve. And soon, whispers of rebellion turned into something else, whispers of revenge. The first attempt was born not in a council chamber, nor in the ranks of colonial militias, but in the damp cellar of a fisherman's home. 7 men and 2 women gathered there, their faces pale, their hands trembling, yet their voices steady. They called themselves the Covenant of Ash. They were not soldiers, not ministers, not leaders of wealth or prestige. They were ordinary people, farmers, sailors, a widow, even a blacksmith's apprentice. What united them was not power, but grief. Each had lost someone to the Wentworth shadow, a child, a brother, a livelihood, a future. The Covenant believed what few dared to speak. The curse was not unstoppable. It was not divine. It was a pact. And like all pacts, it could be broken, but only if the bloodline was severed. Their plan was simple in design, impossible in risk. Infiltrate the Wentworth estate during one of its gatherings and kill Samuel, the vessel himself. In the weeks that followed, they met in silence, sharing scraps of knowledge that had been buried in whispers. One of them, a widow named Eleanor, carried a journal left behind by her late husband, a servant who had once worked in the estate before his sudden death. Within its brittle pages were fragments of symbols he claimed to have seen carved into the cellar walls, symbols older than English letters, marks that seemed to pulse with their own life. Another member, a sailor, swore he had seen Samuel at the harbor speaking to no one, yet the water itself rippled in response, as though answering. They convinced themselves these secrets were not just curses, but weaknesses. If they could strike Samuel in the right moment, if they could sever him from whatever force commanded him, the family's shadow might finally break. The night they chose was stormless, moonless, the estate glowing like a lantern on the hill. They crept across frozen fields, weapons in hand, rusted blades, carpenter's hammers, even a butcher's knife. Ordinary tools against something inhuman. But courage was all they carried. What happened next is preserved only in fragments, half remembered by those who survived long enough to tell the tale. What is certain is this: they reached the doors of the estate. They entered, and they were met not by Samuel alone, but by a gathering that had been waiting for them. Because the Wentworths had known, and betrayal was already among the Covenant's own. They called it the Night of Ashes. The Covenant of Ash never stood a chance. The moment they stepped across the Wentworth threshold, the trap was sprung. Torches roared to life, sealing the doors behind them. The great hall, draped in shadows, was already filled with faces, ministers, merchants, and loyal servants of the Wentworth estate. And at the center, Samuel stood waiting, his expression calm, almost tender, as though he had expected them all along. It was Eleanor who screamed first. She saw him raise a hand and recognized her husband's journal in his grasp. Pages fluttered in the unnatural wind, the ink glowing faintly as if alive. Samuel's smile deepened. "You brought me back what was already mine," he said, his voice layered with that same double tone that rattled bone. The Covenant charged, desperation their only weapon. Steel clanged, wood splintered, cries rang out, but the hall itself seemed to turn against them. Blades dulled in mid-swing. Torches flickered into choking smoke. One man was hurled against the ceiling as if by unseen hands, his body crashing lifeless to the floor. Another clawed at her own throat, choking on air so heavy it was as if the room itself sought to crush her lungs. And then came the fire. Not flame as men know it, but black fire crawling up the walls, devouring light. Witnesses later whispered that the shadows burned, not the wood, that the Covenant themselves were consumed by a darkness that clung like tar, leaving no trace but ash and the stench of sulfur. Only two were said to escape that night: a boy no older than 16, his hair white from terror, and Eleanor, dragged screaming from the estate by men whose loyalty had betrayed her cause. The boy vanished into the wilderness, never to be seen again. Eleanor was found days later at the harbor, her body broken, her tongue cut out, her eyes burned black. She could never speak again, but with her last strength, she carved a message into the wood of the pier. The blood is bound. The curse is fed. From that night forward, resistance in Portsmouth withered. Fear became obedience. The Covenant of Ash was erased from records, their names stricken, their family scattered. The Wentworths emerged untouchable, their curse not weakened but strengthened, fed by the lives of those who dared defy them. And Samuel, now a man baptized in shadow, stood taller than ever, no longer whispered of his cursed, but spoken of his chosen. Yet power that feasts on betrayal cannot remain contained. The curse had been fed too well, and soon it would turn its hunger beyond Portsmouth. After the Night of Ashes, Portsmouth no longer belonged to the people. It belonged to the Wentworths. But curses do not recognize borders, and Samuel's shadow could not be bound to one town. His influence seeped outward, flowing along trade routes, whispered through letters, carried in the breath of terrified merchants who dared not speak his name aloud. The first signs appeared in nearby settlements. In Dover, entire shipments of grain spoiled overnight, while a single Wentworth warehouse remained untouched. In Exeter, a judge known for opposing the family collapsed in court, his last words said to be a plea for forgiveness spoken to someone no one else could see. Sailors carried tales southward, warning that storms seemed to part around ships tied to Wentworth accounts. even as other vessels vanished into the sea. Samuel himself began to travel. No longer confined to Portsmouth, he walked into neighboring colonies with the quiet authority of a man whose name alone carried weight. Wherever he went, leaders bowed, whether from respect, fear, or something deeper. Men described his gaze as suffocating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and knowing the ground beneath you was already crumbling. Women spoke of dreams in which Samuel visited their chambers, leaving them waking with strange marks on their skin, marks shaped like spirals, bruises that did not fade. But what unsettled the colonies most was not Samuel's presence. It was his timing. Wherever he appeared, disaster followed. A fire in a Boston tavern days after his visit claimed 20 lives. A fever in Salem struck only the families who had opposed Wentworth land claims. A militia captain in Maine, who refused to honor a Wentworth trade deal, was found drowned in his own well. Coincidence, they said at first. But how many coincidences must pile upon each other before they become chains? The colonies began to whisper what Portsmouth already knew. The Wentworths were untouchable, not by law, not by faith, not by fate. And Samuel was no longer a mere heir. He was a symbol, a living reminder that power was never earned honestly, but taken, carved from sacrifice, enforced by fear. But even as his influence grew, so too did unease among those closest to him. For every rise demands a cost, and the Wentworth household itself began to fracture. Servants vanished. Siblings succumbed to madness. And deep within the estate's cellar, new carvings began to appear on the stone walls, symbols no one admitted to making. It seemed Samuel's curse was no longer content with enemies alone. It was turning inward, hungering for blood of its own. The Wentworth estate, once a monument of wealth and order, grew into a labyrinth of dread. Servants whispered that the walls themselves groaned at night, as though the house were alive, straining against something it could no longer contain. Doors slammed without wind. Floors trembled under footsteps that belonged to no living man. And in the cellar, the oldest part of the house, symbols multiplied, carved deeper, darker, more jagged than any hand could make in a single night. They appeared in spirals and jagged crosses across the stone, wet to the touch as though the walls themselves were bleeding. Samuel moved through it all as though nothing were wrong. He dined with governors by day, smiling, charming, untouchable. But by night, he descended into the cellar alone. Servants said they could hear him speaking to the walls in that strange double voice, the second tone echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. Some swore they saw light seeping from the cracks in the floor, a sickly pale glow that lingered even after dawn. His family did not fare so well. One sister wasted away in her chamber, her eyes turning black before her body gave out. Another brother went mad, raving that Samuel was not his sibling at all, but an empty vessel carrying the old debt. He was locked away, never seen again. Even Samuel's mother, once proud and commanding, was found wandering the estate gardens at midnight, whispering to the hedges as though expecting them to answer. But the curse's hunger was not limited to kin. Loyal servants disappeared without explanation. Their quarters were found neatly arranged, as though they had left willingly, but their families never saw them again. One maid left behind a single note scrawled in charcoal. The walls are listening. By now, even the most faithful allies of the Wentworths began to feel unease. Visiting ministers grew sick within days of staying in the estate. Merchants who dined at Samuel's table returned to their homes plagued by misfortune. Cattle dead, ships sunk, children struck by fever. And yet, despite all this, they continued to bow. For every ruin that spread from the estate, the Wentworth fortune grew richer, their influence deeper. It was as if the curse itself rewarded their silence. But silence cannot last forever. One night, as the storm wind clawed at the estate and Samuel once again descended into the cellar, a sound was heard that no servant dared admit aloud. Not Samuel's voice, but an answer. Something beneath the estate had begun to speak back. The first night it answered, only a handful of servants heard it. They described the sound as a vibration more than a voice, deep, resonant, echoing through the stone as if the earth itself was speaking. Some claimed it was a language. Others swore it was laughter too vast, too ancient to belong to anything human. Whatever it was, Samuel heard it clearly, and for the first time in years, witnesses claimed to see something new flicker across his face. Not power, not calm, but recognition. He had been waiting for this. From that night on, the estate transformed into something worse than haunted. It became a temple. Samuel held gatherings in the cellar, where ministers and merchants were summoned under the guise of private meetings. What happened within those walls was never spoken of in daylight. But those who left came back changed. Their eyes carried a dull glaze. Their voices faltered when asked of the meetings, and their families reported waking to find them standing at the foot of their beds, watching in silence. The markings on the walls spread faster now, appearing not only in the cellar but in the halls, in the guest chambers, even etched faintly into the glass of the windows. Spirals layered upon spirals, symbols that seemed to shift when stared at too long. Some visitors claimed the carvings bled when touched. Others insisted they moved on their own, as though alive. And Samuel himself, he grew stranger by the day. His voice carried an echo even in the open air. His reflection in mirrors was often delayed, smiling a fraction of a second after he had stopped. Servants swore they saw him in two places at once, standing at a window upstairs while simultaneously walking the gardens below. He was no longer simply cursed. He was becoming something else, something merged with the thing that now whispered from beneath the house. It was around this time that the townspeople began to speak of the hollow sound. They claimed that if you stood too close to the Wentworth estate at night, the ground itself seemed to hum beneath your feet, a low, endless tone that settled into your chest and made your heart stumble. Horses refused to approach. Mothers pulled their children away. Yet the estate never emptied. Powerful men continued to visit, drawn as if summoned, returning with fortunes that seemed too swift, too unnatural to question. But beneath their silence was terror, because if the curse was once confined to whispers, it now had a voice. And that voice was growing louder. The voice did not stay a whisper. What began as a hum through the cellar stones soon bled into the very air of the estate, vibrating through the floorboards, seeping into the lungs of anyone who lingered too long. At first, it was only Samuel who answered, but slowly, one by one, others began to respond, not with words they understood, but with guttural syllables forced from their throats, sounds that left their mouths raw and bleeding. The gatherings in the cellar were no longer meetings. They were rites. The voice demanded, and Samuel obeyed. At first, it asked for offerings of objects, heirlooms, coins, family relics. Each time, the items were placed into the circle of spirals etched on the cellar floor. Each time, they vanished, melted into the stone as if swallowed whole. In return, the merchants who gave them reported sudden prosperity, contracts falling into their hands, rivals falling mysteriously ill. But objects were never enough. Soon, the voice began to hunger for flesh. Servants disappeared at a pace too rapid to ignore. Families searching for loved ones were met with silence at the estate gates. On stormless nights, the townspeople swore they heard screams rise and fall within the mansion, cut off suddenly, followed by that endless, resonant hum. The ground itself seemed to drink the blood, leaving no trace, no stain, as if the earth beneath the Wentworths had been waiting for centuries to be fed. Samuel's transformation deepened. His skin took on a pallor that no sunlight could warm. His eyes, once cold but human, now shimmered faintly in the dark, reflecting candlelight even when unlit. He ate little, slept less, yet his presence grew heavier, his authority sharper. Men who once questioned him found their courage collapse under a single glance. Women who crossed his path woke to nightmares of drowning in spirals, their screams unheard beneath black water. But the most terrifying change was not in Samuel. It was in his followers. Ordinary men began to wear the symbols on their skin, carved into flesh with knives heated in the hearth. They walked the streets at night in silence, their eyes glazed, their lips muttering the syllables that were not words but commands. Portsmouth was no longer just under the curse of a family. It was becoming the mouthpiece of something older, something vast. And as the voice grew louder, it made a single truth clear. It was no longer content to stay beneath the estate. It was preparing to rise. The curse no longer confined itself to the Wentworth estate. It seeped into Portsmouth like a toxin carried on the wind. Farmers spoke of waking to find their livestock standing in rigid silence, all facing the direction of the mansion on the hill. Wells turned black overnight, the water reeking of iron, though no corpse was ever found within. Entire streets were plagued by the same dream, villagers rising in terror, describing the same spiral carved into the earth, the same voice calling them to kneel. And yet, amidst the fear, prosperity spread to those who aligned with the Wentworth name. Ships carrying their goods always returned full, never lost to storm or pirate. Crops in their fields grew even through drought, while neighboring farms withered. Debt collectors working under Wentworth patronage seemed immune to plague, untouched by the fever that swept through poorer households. The message was clear: submit, and you will thrive. Resist, and you will wither. Whispers of rebellion flickered, but they died quickly. In one chilling case, a preacher in Kittery spoke against Samuel by name, warning his flock that the Wentworths were in league with forces not of God. Days later, his congregation arrived at church to find him nailed to his own pulpit, eyes removed, chest carved with the spiral. No one claimed responsibility. No one dared to. His church was abandoned, but the spiral on the pulpit never faded. The infection spread further. Colonies to the south reported strange events that echoed Portsmouth's plight. Taverns collapsing without reason, entire households vanishing overnight, rivers filled with fish that floated belly up, their eyes missing. Everywhere Samuel traveled, the curse followed like a shadow, spilling outward, swallowing coastlines, tightening its grip. Merchants began to call him the unyielding. Governors invited him into councils with trembling hands. And when Samuel spoke, even the boldest men lowered their gaze. It wasn't his words, it was the weight behind them, the echo of the thing beneath, pressing down on every soul in earshot. But curses have appetites, and this one's hunger was endless. The voice beneath was no longer content with wealth or obedience. Its whispers began to demand expansion, commanding Samuel not to rule a town, not a colony, but an entire land. The Wentworth curse was no longer a family secret. It was becoming America's inheritance. By now, Samuel Wentworth was more than a man. He was a vessel. The voice beneath the estate had twined itself around his bloodline, fusing ambition with something older, darker, and inhuman. And with every offering, every ritual, every life consumed in silence, the voice whispered a single command that grew louder by the day: expand. Samuel obeyed. He began weaving his influence into the very bones of colonial power. Governors found themselves indebted to him, their debts erased overnight in exchange for loyalty. Judges who once ruled fairly bent their sentences to favor his allies. Merchants who resisted found their ships split open in calm seas, their bodies washing ashore days later, eyes carved with spirals. And yet, those who submitted thrived. Families of no renown suddenly flourished, their fortunes multiplying, their children spared from plague. But the voice did not want obedience alone. It wanted design. Samuel began pushing for land acquisitions, forcing treaties with indigenous tribes that mysteriously ended in bloodshed. He redirected trade routes, quietly shaping the colony's economy to depend on Wentworth-controlled networks. His family name embedded itself into charters, property deeds, and colonial councils. The curse was no longer feeding only on individuals. It was grafting itself onto the future, into the very architecture of America's rise. And with each victory, Samuel grew stranger. His shadow often stretched against the direction of the sun. Witnesses claimed he could silence a room simply by entering, though his lips never moved. Some swore his footsteps left faint spiral impressions in dirt and snow, markings that never melted or washed away. Ministers tasked with denouncing him from the pulpit fell mute mid-sermon, clutching their throats, their voices never returning. The colonies were changing under his hand, and yet not all bowed. Whispers of resistance stirred in taverns and meeting houses. Men and women who saw Samuel not as a leader, but as a parasite sucking the marrow of a nation not yet born. They spoke of forming alliances, of calling upon both faith and steel to stand against the Wentworth curse. But resistance was exactly what the voice desired, because rebellion meant blood, and blood was the one offering it had never ceased to demand. So when the first sparks of defiance lit the colonies, Samuel only smiled, for he knew the curse had grown too large to be stopped. It was no longer a whisper beneath the estate. It was a hand reaching into the future. The resistance began in shadows. Small circles of men and women met in taverns after midnight, whispering Samuel's name as though afraid the walls themselves would betray them. Farmers, ministers, ship captains, even former allies of the Wentworths gathered under candlelight, convinced that if they did not act soon, the colonies themselves would rot from within. They called themselves the Ashen Cross, a name meant to defy the spiral, a symbol of breaking cycles, of refusing to bow. But the curse was already listening. The first strike of resistance came swiftly. One night, torches in hand, the Ashen Cross stormed the estate grounds. Their goal was simple: burn the cellar, destroy the symbols, and sever Samuel from whatever force he had bound himself to. Eyewitnesses said the night was eerily calm. No wind, no sound, only the steady rhythm of boots on soil. For a moment, it seemed possible the Wentworths, caught in their sleep, would fall. They never reached the cellar. The earth itself betrayed them. Witnesses from the town swore they saw the ground split open around the estate, not with fire or quake, but with silence, an impossible tearing of air, as if the night itself had been ripped apart. Men screamed without voices, torches extinguished by nothing, and from the darkness came figures. Not soldiers, not men, shapes that moved like shadows given form, spiraled and twisted, crawling and yet towering, their bodies etched with the very symbols carved in the cellar. By morning, not a single member of the Ashen Cross remained. The estate's gates stood open, torches burning on either side, untouched by the night's violence. Only one thing was left behind: a single wooden cross, scorched black, standing upright in the center of the Wentworth courtyard, planted like a warning. Word spread faster than plague. Families who once considered resistance fled Portsmouth altogether, abandoning homes, farms, and churches. Others submitted more deeply, wearing spirals around their necks as talismans, branding them into door frames, muttering chants in the hope that the curse would pass them by. The Wentworths had not only crushed rebellion, they had turned defiance into fuel, blood into power. And Samuel? He stood at his window the next dawn, watching the sun rise over an emptying town, a smile carving across his face. For every enemy destroyed, the curse tightened its hold. The Ashen Cross had been erased, but their failed defiance awakened something the voice had long awaited: open worship. And once men begin to worship, they can never return to silence. After the Ashen Cross was annihilated, something shifted. Fear no longer hid in whispers, it strutted in daylight. The Wentworth estate became more than a mansion, it became a temple. Men who once trembled at the thought of Samuel now approached his gates willingly, carrying gifts, kneeling at the threshold, begging to be accepted into his circle. They carved spirals into their doors, inked them into their flesh, taught their children to trace the symbols before sleep, as if prayer. The curse had become a creed. Samuel encouraged it, but the truth was darker. He no longer needed to demand loyalty. The voice beneath the estate was pulling them in like a tide. Merchants offered wealth. Ministers twisted scripture to justify allegiance, and entire families surrendered their names to the Wentworths in exchange for protection. What had begun as a hidden pact in a cellar now stood as a living cult, threading its way through every layer of colonial society. Rituals became public. Villagers gathered at the estate on moonless nights, chanting words they did not understand, voices blending into that terrible hum. The spiral, once a secret, was burned into banners, etched into tools, sewn into clothing. Children were born into it, their first cries drowned beneath chants that promised binding to the future. And when an infant failed to survive, its body was taken, not to the graveyard, but to the cellar. Always the cellar. The influence spread far beyond Portsmouth. Colonial leaders from Massachusetts to Virginia were quietly drawn into the orbit of the Wentworths, attending midnight gatherings under the guise of trade meetings. They returned to their colonies richer, stronger, and hungrier. Those who resisted, those who asked too many questions, vanished. No graves, no bodies, only spirals scrawled on doorsteps as silent warnings. And Samuel himself had grown unrecognizable, his features sharpened unnaturally, as though time bent around him. Some claimed he had not aged in a decade, his skin unwrinkled, his eyes carrying a faint glow even in daylight. His voice no longer merely echoed, it compelled. When he spoke, men obeyed before realizing they had moved. When he commanded silence, entire crowds fell still, even infants ceasing to cry. He was no longer a leader. He was a living vessel. Yet, beneath the worship and fear, a deeper terror stirred. The voice was no longer content with Samuel alone. It was whispering to others, reaching through dreams, planting commands in the minds of children, pulling strangers toward Portsmouth like moths to flame. The Wentworth curse had transcended bloodline. It had become contagious. The contagion spread like a fever, silent, invisible, and unstoppable. It began with dreams. Men and women across the colonies awoke in the dead of night, drenched in sweat, gasping for air. Each described the same vision, a spiral carved into endless black stone, stretching down and down until their minds cracked trying to see its end. Some tried to dismiss it, but the dreams returned, night after night, louder, sharper, until waking life felt like the echo of a nightmare. Then came the compulsions. Farmers who had never traveled farther than their village began abandoning their fields, walking for days without food or water, their feet carrying them toward Portsmouth as though guided by invisible chains. Children traced spirals into dirt and frost with sticks, humming melodies they had never been taught. Sailors in distant ports whispered the Wentworth name like a prayer, though none could recall how they had heard it. Colonial leaders began noticing strange alignments. Court records filled with merchants tied to Wentworth contracts. Churches reported dwindling attendance as congregations gathered instead in private homes, chanting words that made ministers pale with terror. Land deeds shifted hands mysteriously, almost always funneling back to families who had pledged loyalty to Samuel. It was as if the curse was reprogramming society itself, bending the colonies into a spiral of dependence. But the most disturbing changes appeared in the young. Infants who survived the cellar rites grew into children unlike any others. Their eyes carried a cold intensity, their voices too steady, too commanding. Teachers reported that these children learned faster, spoke in languages they had never been taught, and, most chilling of all, could silence entire classrooms with a single glance. They were not simply cursed, they were chosen, living extensions of the voice beneath the estate. Rumors spread of towns where the spiral appeared carved into trees overnight, where rivers bent their courses unnaturally, flowing not toward the sea but toward the direction of Portsmouth. Hunters swore they found animals slaughtered in patterns, arranged in circles with their eyes removed. Every sign, every omen, pointed to the same conclusion. The curse was no longer bound by the Wentworth estate. It was rewriting the land itself. And yet, Samuel did not try to contain it. He welcomed it. He stood at the heart of the storm, knowing that the contagion was not an accident. It was preparation, for the voice had promised him something greater than wealth, greater than power. It had promised him a throne. The promise of a throne consumed Samuel Wentworth. No longer satisfied with wealth or quiet control, he turned his gaze to the colonies themselves, not as settlements, but as a kingdom in waiting. And behind his ambition, the voice whispered like a crown of fire pressed against his skull. not servant, not vessel, sovereign. Samuel began to maneuver with a precision that defied chance. Alliances between rival merchants mysteriously collapsed, their ruin funneling opportunities back to him. Governors who resisted him suffered sudden strokes, leaving pliable successors in place. Even the crown's representatives from England found themselves caught in webs of scandal and debt, their downfall orchestrated with surgical cruelty. Every thread pulled tighter, weaving Samuel into the fabric of authority. But his pursuit of power wasn't only political. He staged rituals disguised as gatherings of state, feasts that doubled as ceremonies where guests unknowingly became participants. Wine was poured in silver cups etched with spirals. Prayers were spoken in words presented as Latin yet older, and candles flickered with unnatural steadiness as shadows stretched impossibly long against the walls. Guests who drank and feasted returned to their homes more loyal, more willing to serve, unable to explain why they dreamed of black staircases descending endlessly. His cult, no longer hidden, rebranded itself as a society of influence, the Circle of Providence. Men of means clamored to be included, ignorant of the depth of what they pledged. The circle promised protection, prosperity, and foresight, but every oath sworn was another chain binding the colonies into the spiral's design. Even churches fractured as ministers secretly joined the circle, their sermons bending towards strange allegories of chosen bloodlines and destiny beyond the reach of God. And through it all, Samuel remained untouchable. He was seen everywhere, yet never vulnerable. An assassination attempt in Boston ended with a would-be killer found hanging from the beams of his own home, body twisted into the shape of a spiral. A poisoned chalice shattered in Samuel's hand, the liquid spilling harmlessly, searing the floorboards where it landed. It seemed the curse itself defended him, guarding its vessel as one guards a king before coronation. But the voice beneath the estate was restless. It did not speak of colonies. It spoke of empires. The spiral was not meant to bind Portsmouth or even America alone. It was meant to reach across oceans, to rewrite the destiny of nations. And so Samuel prepared for more than rule. He prepared for ascension. The question was no longer whether the Wentworths would dominate history. It was whether history itself would survive their reign. For all his power, Samuel Wentworth had not gone unnoticed. Across the Atlantic, whispers of his influence reached England, not as rumors of trade or politics, but as warnings cloaked in secrecy. Reports filtered back to the crown of colonial gatherings where spirals replaced crosses, of governors who spoke with voices not their own, of merchants whose fortunes doubled overnight only to vanish into Wentworth hands. What troubled them most was the same phrase repeated in every report: the Circle of Providence. The crown dismissed the early rumors as superstition, yet there were those in London who knew better. Men belonging to older orders, secret societies predating even the monarchy itself, recognized the signs. They knew of curses that could bleed across generations, of whispers that crawled beneath stone, of bloodlines chosen not by God, but by something far older. These orders had battled such forces before, and they had lost more times than they had won. The Wentworths, they realized, were not merely ambitious colonists. They were a threat to empire itself. So they acted. Ships set sail for the New World, carrying not soldiers but scholars, priests, and men sworn to silence. Hidden among merchants and settlers, they infiltrated the colonies, seeking evidence of the curse, tracing the spiral wherever it appeared. They carried relics of old wars, crosses blackened by fire, chalices said to burn the corrupted, knives inscribed with countersymbols meant to sever blood oaths. These were not weapons for battlefields, but for rituals. Yet Samuel was waiting. The voice beneath the estate had warned him. They come with chains, but they will kneel. And so, when these men of secret orders arrived, they found not frightened colonists, but towns already bent to the spiral. Inns whispered their names before they gave them. Churches shunned their presence. And at night, they dreamed the same dreams as those they came to save. Some resisted for a time, but most fell. By the time they reached Portsmouth, half their number had defected to Samuel's cause, lured by promises of forbidden power. Those who remained true confronted Samuel in the estate itself. They carried their relics, spoke their counter-prayers, and believed they had cornered him at last. Witnesses later swore that for hours, thunder rolled without rain, lights flickered in patterns, and the estate itself groaned as if alive. When it ended, only Samuel emerged, unharmed, smiling. The relics were gone. The priests were never seen again. And in their place, the spiral spread faster, as though swallowing not just men, but the very weapons meant to stop it. It became clear that the Wentworth curse was not defending itself anymore. It was consuming its enemies, growing stronger with every failed attempt to end it. The colonies were tearing in two directions at once. On one side, the call for rebellion against England thundered louder each year. Taxes, soldiers, and tyranny stoked anger in taverns and town squares. On the other side, beneath that political fire, another shadow pulled tighter, the unseen dominion of the Wentworth curse. Men marched in the streets for liberty by day, then by night found themselves kneeling before spirals, whispering chants older than the language of their laws. It was no accident. Samuel understood the art of timing. He let rebellion simmer, knowing that chaos was the perfect soil for corruption. He funded certain voices, silenced others, and ensured that no matter who cried for freedom, the echo always bent back to him. Leaders who thought they were shaping history often awoke to find themselves repeating words Samuel had whispered weeks before. He was not choosing a side between crown and colonies. He was making both sides his pawns. Portsmouth became a nexus of contradictions. Patriots planning resistance drank in taverns that displayed spiral carvings. Ministers preached of God while their churches hid spiral sigils beneath the altar. Even militia captains swore oaths of loyalty to the revolution while wearing pendants given to them by Samuel's circle. Independence, loyalty, rebellion, obedience. It all tangled together in one truth. The curse owned them all. And yet, cracks began to show. Not everyone bowed. There were whispers of men who fought the spiral in secret, those who burned their marks from doorframes and tore the pendants from their necks. Families disappeared into the woods, living off the land rather than risk contamination. Rumors of a new resistance surfaced, not tavern meetings, but clandestine rituals of their own. They called themselves the Severed Path, and their purpose was singular: to break the Wentworth bloodline before it consumed the revolution itself. Samuel, of course, knew of them. He allowed their whispers to grow, as though testing their strength. But when he closed his eyes at night, he felt the voice stirring with urgency. It warned him not of rebels or kings, but of time. The throne promised was near, but it was not eternal. There was a window, a narrow moment when ascension could be seized or lost forever. The colonies were preparing for war. Samuel was preparing for something far greater. And deep beneath the estate, the voice began to rise, no longer content with whispers. It wanted form. It began with the ground itself. Those who lived near the Wentworth estate spoke of tremors rattling their homes, though no earthquakes were recorded. Cattle refused to graze in fields that once thrived. Wells turned bitter overnight, water shimmering with an oily sheen that no bucket could clear. Trees warped as if bending toward the mansion, their branches twisting into spiral patterns against the sky. The land was not cursed anymore. It was changing, reshaped by something clawing its way into the physical world. And at the center stood Samuel. Witnesses described him walking the estate grounds barefoot in the dead of winter, steam rising from his skin as if fire burned within. His shadow no longer obeyed the sun. It bent at angles, curling unnaturally, always pointing toward the cellar beneath the house. Animals fell silent in his presence. Dogs howled until their throats tore, and then cowered, refusing to look at him. Children stared too long at his face and burst into tears, claiming his eyes looked like glass filled with fire. The voice was no longer content to whisper. It was shaping him into its vessel. Samuel's once human body became the scaffolding for something older. His strength grew. Men twice his size found their bones broken with a single strike. His voice, once commanding, now carried an undertone that made listeners bleed from their ears if they resisted. And more terrifying still, his dreams began to spill outward. Portsmouth villagers reported sleepwalking in unison, hundreds gathering in fields at night to stand in silence, staring toward the estate as if awaiting command. Ships anchored offshore swore they heard chants drifting across the water, even when no gatherings were seen. Entire towns began to hum at once, as though a single mind threaded through them all, pulsing with the spiral's rhythm. The severed path grew desperate. They believed Samuel was no longer just a man. He was becoming something unkillable. They broke into graveyards, seeking relics older than the colonies, bones of witches and heretics, anything rumored to hold power against a vessel. They carved counterspirals into trees, into their own skin, believing pain was the only shield against corruption. Some succeeded in resisting the dreams, but many lost their sanity. To fight the curse was to bleed into madness. And still, the transformation quickened. Samuel's reflection vanished from mirrors. His breath steamed in every season. His blood, when spilled, shimmered black like tar and evaporated before touching earth. The voice was fusing with him, not merely speaking through him, but preparing to wear him as its form. The land had bent. The people had bent. Now, reality itself began to bend. The year of revolution dawned with muskets primed, but what history remembers as politics and war was, in Portsmouth, something far darker. While colonists prepared to cast off the crown, the Wentworth curse prepared to cast off humanity itself. Samuel stood at the center of both storms, his influence threading through patriots and loyalists alike, his curse entwined in every oath sworn beneath banners of freedom. To the outside world, Portsmouth seemed divided like every other colony. But those who walked its streets at night knew better. Torchlight revealed spiral symbols carved into cobblestones, too deep to have been chiseled by human hands. When rain fell, it gathered not in puddles, but in perfect circular pools, rippling without wind. The air itself carried a hum, faint yet constant, as though the land had become a living instrument playing one endless note. Samuel moved like a general of shadows. He convened gatherings under the guise of patriotic councils, yet behind closed doors, the meetings were rituals. Maps of battlefields became altars. Muskets and bayonets were laid out in spirals, consecrated not to king or country, but to the voice beneath the earth. Even speeches for liberty were laced with hidden phrases, chants disguised as rhetoric, that bound the listeners to Samuel without their knowing. Every man who marched for independence carried not just powder and shot, but the seed of the spiral within his soul. Yet not all bowed willingly. The severed path rose like a hidden army, weaving through taverns, farms, and forests, seeking to break the bloodline before the revolution itself became enslaved. They warned that if Samuel ascended during this chaos, America would not be born free. It would be born cursed, its destiny shackled to the spiral. They spread their counter-symbols in secret, carving inverted spirals into barns and trees, slipping charms beneath floorboards, whispering incantations into the ears of children as they slept. To the patriots, they were traitors. To Samuel, they were prey. The clash was inevitable. One night, on the outskirts of Portsmouth, the severed path ambushed Samuel's circle. Witnesses swore the air itself split open with lightless fire. Muskets jammed, blades shattered. Men screamed without voices leaving their throats. The ground opened in spirals, swallowing bodies whole. By dawn, nothing remained but scorched earth twisted into a perfect vortex. Of the severed path, few survived, and those who did carried burns in the shape of spirals etched permanently into their flesh. Samuel had not only survived, he had thrived. The failed resistance seemed to fuel his transformation. His voice now rolled with two tones, human and inhuman, echoing even in silence. His skin shimmered faintly in moonlight, as though veined with molten silver. He was no longer preparing for ascension. He was on the cusp of it. And as the first shots of revolution fired in Lexington and Concord, Samuel whispered to his circle, "This war is not for liberty. It is my coronation." The Revolutionary War exploded like wildfire, yet beneath the smoke and cannon fire, something older stirred. Every musket ball, every drumbeat, every cry for freedom carried the hidden echo of the spiral. For those who marched under flags of liberty, unseen chains wound tighter around their souls, binding the revolution to the Wentworth curse. It was most visible in battle. Soldiers swore the air, sometimes bent unnaturally, musket balls curving as though guided by invisible hands. Cannons misfired without reason, only to roar with unholy precision when Samuel's circle stood nearby. Men who had never held a blade before fought with unnatural skill, their eyes glazed, their movements mechanical, puppets on the strings of a voice none could hear. The Patriots won victories that should have been impossible. The price, though unseen, was written into the marrow of their blood. Even the leaders were not untouched. Letters meant for Congress went missing, only to resurface rewritten with subtle shifts in tone. Orders whispered in council meetings later repeated Samuel's own rhetoric, as though his voice had traveled unseen across miles to plant itself in their minds. His influence seeped into both camps, patriot and loyalist alike, feeding the war's fire while tightening his grasp on destiny. To Samuel, the revolution was not a cause, but a ritual. The blood spilled on battlefields was an offering, and every death fed the crown that waited for him beneath the earth. But the severed path was not yet finished. Broken, scattered, and branded by the spiral itself, they adapted. They learned to fight not with muskets or swords, but with memory and symbol. They carved counterspirals into the stocks of rifles, slipped whispered prayers into the ears of generals, and smuggled relics of Europe's older wars into the colonies. Their mission was no longer to save America. It was to stop Samuel before his ascension made the revolution a permanent sacrifice. Still, the curse spread faster than they could resist. Entire regiments reported dreams of spiraling staircases, where faceless figures crowned them in fire. Officers wrote in journals of seeing Samuel on battlefields where he could not have been, his glass-fire eyes watching from ridges, his voice humming beneath the thunder of cannons. Some claimed he was no longer bound by distance at all, that the curse allowed him to stand in every battle at once, harvesting souls like a king collecting taxes. The revolution raged, but to Samuel, it was already decided. Every fallen soldier was another brick in his throne. Every drop of blood was mortar. And as the war stretched on, the question was no longer whether the colonies would be free, but whether freedom itself was nothing more than a mask for the spiral. The war neared its peak, but beneath the clash of nations, Samuel's true war pressed toward its conclusion. Yorktown, Saratoga, Bunker Hill, battles etched into history as turning points, were in truth diversions, pieces of a grander ritual. Samuel had not simply watched the revolution unfold. He had orchestrated it, feeding the chaos, weaving each victory and loss into a tapestry designed not for liberty, but for ascension. The land itself bore witness. Farmers found spiral-shaped scorch marks burned into their fields after battles. Streams ran red, not only with blood, but with a metallic shimmer, as though the earth itself bled alongside the soldiers. Even the sky betrayed the truth. Strange halos appeared around the moon, and on certain nights, the stars above seemed to form spirals too perfect to be coincidence. Nature was not indifferent. It was enslaved to the ritual. Samuel withdrew deeper into the Wentworth estate as the war raged. Few saw him directly, yet his presence infected everything. Couriers carrying letters to Washington vanished, their bodies later discovered with spiral carvings etched into their chests. Ships meant to bring supplies from France were lost at sea, their last logs describing a whirlpool of fire opening beneath the waves. The revolution, history says, turned by luck and strategy. But in truth, Samuel's curse pulled unseen strings, ensuring every sacrifice was another step toward his coronation. The severed path knew the end was near. They believed Samuel's ascension would coincide with the final, decisive battle of the war. And so, they prepared their last defiance. They sought relics said to predate Christ himself, iron nails unearthed from Druid graves, fragments of bone from witches burned in Europe, black stones stolen from forgotten catacombs. Their plan was desperate, bordering madness, to confront Samuel not on the battlefield of men, but on the battlefield of the curse itself. Yet Samuel was ready. He had carved a throne from the stone beneath his mansion, a seat etched with spirals so deep they glowed faintly in the dark. His circle, no longer men but husks filled with whispers, stood around it like statues. And there, in the cellar that had once been a simple foundation, Samuel prepared to shed his final trace of mortality. The war outside thundered on, but in the darkness of Portsmouth the true climax brewed. Muskets, cannons, and armies would decide who ruled a nation, but the spiral would decide who ruled history itself. The night of reckoning came, cloaked in storm. Thunder rolled over Portsmouth, though no lightning split the sky. Instead, the heavens churned in silence, a dark spiral of clouds forming directly above the Wentworth estate. The town below trembled. Lamps flickered, animals shrieked, and men who had fought in war fell to their knees, muttering prayers they could no longer remember. It was not weather. It was summons. Samuel sat upon his throne of spirals, body and voice no longer wholly his own. His flesh shimmered as though stretched over something vast and inhuman. The silver veins that webbed his skin pulsed with each heartbeat, glowing faintly in the cellar's gloom. Around him, his circle stood lifeless, eyes blank, mouths murmuring chants older than the soil beneath their feet. They were not men anymore, but conduits, pillars channeling the voice's arrival into the world. The ritual was nearly complete. Each cannon fired in the distance, each soldier's scream on the battlefield, each drop of blood spilled in America's struggle echoed into the cellar like offerings. Samuel felt it, every sacrifice, every death funneling into him, fusing him tighter with the entity beneath. His words thundered in two voices now, layered atop one another, one human, one vast, commanding. Tonight, a crown is placed upon eternity. But he was not unopposed. The severed path gathered in the storm, cloaked figures clutching relics that glowed faintly in defiance of the spiral's pull. Iron nails blackened by forgotten fire. Bones that rattled with whispers of ancient witches. Stones carved with countersymbols stolen from catacombs that history never dared record. They moved through the rain like shadows, their leader, his face burned with spiral scars, raising a dagger, said to be carved from the horn of a beast that never walked this earth. Their plan was clear: sever the ritual, not by killing Samuel, but by breaking the vessel. If his body could not contain the entity, the ascension would collapse, dragging Samuel and his bloodline into the abyss forever. But Samuel knew they were coming. He could feel them, every footstep a tremor against his throne, and he welcomed it. Because the voice had promised him this confrontation was necessary. Blood must clash with blood. Resistance must burn so that power may be perfected. The storm cracked, though no lightning shone. The severed path reached the estate gates. The spiral throne glowed brighter in the cellar. The final battle was no longer for America's freedom. It was for the soul of history itself. The gates of the Wentworth estate groaned open as though pushed not by hands, but by the storm itself. The severed path surged forward, their cloaks whipped by the spiraling wind, their relics burning like embers against the unnatural dark. Each step they took felt heavier, as though the ground itself resisted them, dragging their bodies toward the cellar where Samuel waited. Inside, the throne pulsed. Samuel rose from it, taller than before, his body stretched by something beyond human measure. His eyes were no longer eyes, but twin spirals of liquid silver, pulling in the dim light. His circle of husks chanted louder. their voices rising in a pitch that rattled the very stones of the house. The cellar had become a womb, and something vast pressed against its unseen walls, straining to be born into the world. The severed path burst through the doors, the storm screaming with them. Their leader raised the horn blade high, its surface slick with unnatural darkness, and shouted words no tongue had uttered in centuries. At once, the relics they carried blazed with defiant fire, casting inverted spirals onto the walls. The cellar shook. The husks faltered. For the first time, Samuel's chant stumbled. But he did not fall. Instead, he laughed, two voices echoing, one deep, one inhuman, overlapping like chains grinding against one another. His silver-veined hands stretched outward, and the air itself bent. One by one, members of the severed path collapsed, clutching their heads, their minds flooded by visions of endless spirals devouring sky, sea, and flesh. Blood poured from their noses and ears, spiraling outward on the stone floor as though obeying his command. The leader staggered, but did not fall. With every ounce of will, he drove the horn blade forward. Samuel caught it in his palm. Flesh split, silver ichor spilling, yet his smile widened. "Do you not see?" His voices thundered. "Your defiance is part of the crown. Every strike, every curse, every prayer you whisper, it feeds me. I am the revolution. I am the throne." The horn blade trembled in the leader's hands, its glow dimming against the storm of Samuel's power. Around them, the husks screamed, their bodies twisting into monstrous shapes, limbs elongating, jaws splitting wide, spirals burning into their flesh as they became guardians of the ritual. The cellar was no longer a room. It was a battlefield between worlds. The severed path faltered, but still they pressed on, their relics blazing brighter, their chants rising higher. Samuel's power surged, the spirals spinning faster, the voice within him roaring for release. Something had to break. Vessel or curse, bloodline or relic. The storm reached its peak, and in that suspended moment, the fate of America, and perhaps all history, balanced on a knife's edge. The storm collapsed inward. The cellar walls groaned and split as if the house itself were being devoured. Spirals of silver fire tore through the stone, consuming everything they touched. The severed path screamed their counterchants until their throats bled, their relics glowing like fragments of dying stars. Samuel stood in the center, arms spread wide, his body unraveling, half man, half something vast and radiant, a crown of spirals flickering above his head. The leader of the severed path staggered forward, hornblade in hand, his face lit by both terror and defiance. With one last cry, he drove the blade into Samuel's chest. The sound was not flesh tearing, but reality itself splitting. For a moment, silence. Then, everything broke. The throne shattered. The husks shrieked as their bodies collapsed into spiraling ash. Samuel screamed, not in pain, but in triumph, as silver ichor poured from his wound, spiraling upward into the storm. The voice roared, not from beneath the earth, but from everywhere at once. Windows across Portsmouth shattered. Children awoke screaming, drawing spirals in the air with their fingers. Soldiers froze mid-battle, eyes wide with visions of a crown descending through fire. And then, darkness. When dawn broke, the estate was gone. In its place was a crater, its edges scorched into spiral patterns visible for miles. The severed path vanished, their relics lost to history. Of Samuel Wentworth, no trace remained, save whispers that the crown was not destroyed, only hidden. Some claimed it sank beneath the soil, waiting for another vessel. Others swore the revolution itself carried the curse forward, embedding it in the bones of the new nation. History would record none of it. The revolution ended, freedom declared, a nation born. But beneath the official pages, a silence remains, a gap where something unspeakable once was. Families still whisper of the Wentworth line. Farmers still plow up spiral scars in the earth. And in certain storms, when the clouds twist in unnatural patterns, some swear they hear it, the faint hum of a voice, waiting, patient, eternal. So now, I turn to you. Where are you watching this from? Type it in the comments. Let the world know you are awake. And if you've walked with me through this darkness, you know what must be done. Like, subscribe, share this story before it disappears again. Because the Wentworth curse was never broken. And when the spiral comes for you, history will not remember your name.